Hey guys, welcome back to part 3 of the broadcast receiver tutorial. So now we already learned how to statically and dynamically register a broadcast receiver that listens for different system events. But instead of just listening for system broadcasts, we can also send and receive our very own broadcasts. And these broadcasts can be explicit broadcasts, which means that we specify the component that we want to trigger directly. For example, we could say, okay, we want to send a broadcast that only triggers our example broadcast receiver and no other broadcast receiver. Or we can send an implicit broadcast, which is basically the same as the system broadcast that we saw earlier, where we just define an action. And then if a broadcast receiver wants to receive this broadcast, we have to set an intent filter with the same action on it. But we also learned that since Android Oreo, we have some strict limitations on these implicit broadcasts, because we can't register a broadcast receiver that listens for implicit broadcasts in the manifest file anymore, which means that we can't listen for them if our app is not currently running. Instead, we have to register our broadcast receiver dynamically, somewhere in the lifecycle of our app, and then it can only listen for these broadcasts as long as the app is running. This limits our possibilities quite a bit, because we can't wake up apps anymore with our own implicit broadcasts, but nevertheless we will take a look at it in this video and learn about explicit broadcasts in a later part. Okay, we are still in our example broadcast receiver class, where we currently listen for the connectivity action broadcast. And this is just a constant for this string. In the same way we can define our own actions as a string. So we change this part here, connectivity manager.connectivity_action, to our own action string. And it's important to note that the namespace for broadcast actions is global, which means that your action string has to be unique, otherwise it could conflict with other apps. And a good way to create these unique strings is by using your package name. In this case it's com.codingandflow. And here we could also add the app name, but to keep it a bit shorter I will keep it like this and call it com.codingandflow.example_action, like this. This is now our own custom broadcast action for which we want to listen. And from our connectivity action broadcast we received this extra no connectivity. This is also just a string. In the same way we can also send extras with our own broadcasts. So we delete everything within the if statement, and we will send an extra in form of a string, and we save it in a string variable, received text equals intent.getStringExtra. Before we had a boolean extra, now we have a string extra. And here we have to define another string for the name of this extra. Again, we use our package name, com.codingandflow, and I call it extra_text. This is basically the key for this extra, so we can later identify it. And then we simply show a toast message, which contains the string as its text, to show that we actually received it. Okay, that's it for the broadcast receiver. Now let's switch over to our main activity Java file. Up here we still create an instance of our broadcast receiver, and currently we register it in onStart and unregister it in onStop. But we will not send this broadcast from this app, we will send it from another app, which means that this app here will be in the background when we send this broadcast. This also means that we can't unregister it in onStop, because this method will be called when our app goes in the background. Instead we will move these two lines from onStart to onCreate. We delete onStart. And when we register it in onCreate, we have to unregister it in onDestroy. So we move unregister broadcast receiver from onStop to onDestroy and delete onStop. And now we will only unregister this broadcast receiver when our activity is destroyed, which happens for example when we leave it over the back button, but not if we just put it into the background. And of course we also have to change this intent filter, because we want it to be triggered from our own custom broadcast. So we pass the same string that we defined in our example broadcast receiver. com.codingandflow.example_action. So now I'm going to create a new Android Studio project. And I have called this app Broadcast Sender. I have also already prepared the layout, which contains this one text view and the send broadcast button. And when we press this button, it calls our send broadcast method here. And sending a broadcast is pretty simple. We create an intent, call it intent equals new intent. Here we define the action, which is our com.codingandflow.exampleAction. We add an extra to this intent with intent.putExtra. We define the name, which is our com.codingandflow.exampleAction. extra underscore text, comma, and the value. And since it's a string extra, we have to pass a string here. We will simply write broadcast received. And if everything works correctly, our other app will then show this text as a toast message. And now we can simply send our broadcast with sendBroadcast and we pass this intent. So when we click this button, it will send an implicit broadcast with this action string and with this broadcast received text as its extra. Pretty straightforward. But we will also put another broadcast receiver into this app, which will then update this text view. Until now we always created our broadcast receiver as a top level class. But if we want to update the user interface of our activity, we can also put it into this activity as an inner class. Because then we can access the activity variables like this text view directly. And one way to do this is as an anonymous inner class. We can simply write private broadcast receiver, call it broadcast receiver equals new broadcast receiver. And the same as in our top level class, we override this onReceive method. Down here we put a semicolon. And here we want to do the same as in our other broadcast receiver. We want to receive the text. String received text equals intent.get string extra. Again, we define the name. And instead of showing it in a toast message, we will set it on our text view like this. And you can also use the broadcast receiver as an inner class to listen for system broadcasts if you want to update your user interface in reaction to these broadcasts. And we will register this broadcast receiver in on start, because in order to send this broadcast we have to click our button, which also means that our app has to be in the foreground, so we don't need this broadcast receiver when our app is in the background. And we do it the usual way. We create an intent filter, call it filter equals new intent filter. We define our action string. We register our broadcast receiver by passing this variable name, and we pass our intent filter. And in onStop we unregister it. Okay, so now let's start both our apps and test it. So this is our first app without the button, which will then show the toast message. And this is the broadcast sending app. So when we click this button, we should send our custom broadcast, which should then change this message here to broadcast received, because we sent this as an extra. And it should at the same time show a toast message, which is not triggered by this app, but by the other app. So let's test it. And it works. Now when I close the other app, we will go through on destroy, which means that we now unregistered the broadcast receiver in the other app and shouldn't see our toast message anymore. So let's test it again, and nothing. Now sending and receiving a broadcast within the same activity probably doesn't make much sense in a real app, but you could for example send a broadcast from a service and receive it in an activity to update the user interface. But this also means that potentially other apps could receive your broadcast, so you shouldn't use it to send any sensitive information. If you just want to send a broadcast within the same app, you should use the local broadcast manager instead, because there you don't have these security issues. And we will talk about security measures and the local broadcast manager in a future part. And also we didn't learn about explicit broadcasts yet, which we will also do later. So make sure to subscribe to the channel to not miss that, and if this video was helpful, please leave a like. Take care.